Is that what it? I think it's what I've heard.
I don't know then. I'll have to check.
All right, we are going to dip our toes and maybe more of our up to our waist in chapter 24 today, which, as I said, is really a continuation of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. The title of the chapter is Monetary Policy Theory. And the first thing I want to note is that if you guys have been reading, you can skip the very last section of this chapter called Lower Bound, Zero Lower Bound. It's a new section that they added onto this chapter, and I don't think it's worth covering given our time constraints and stuff. It's kind of some interesting stuff, but it's the very last section. So none of your homework problems or test problems will be covered on that, nor will I go over it in class. I'll be happy to meet with any of you individually if you're just dying to know about the chapter. I'll see you guys. Help you out there. So today, we're going to look at monetary policy. So kind of monetary policy and aggregate demand, aggregate supply, which we've kind of talked about already, but we're going to talk about inflation targeting and output stabilization. So let's pose a question here. Is inflation targeting the best monetary policy? Which is what we're currently doing. What's our current inflation target? 2%. So that's our example. Our current Federal Reserve is pursuing an inflation target of 2%. The dual mandate says that they're also going to be looking out for unemployment or hence GDP. And so that's another thing that they're thinking about. And so we're going to kind of look at the trade-offs of having inflation target using aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So let's start off, first of all, with, we're going to work through some examples. And of a temporary aggregate demand shock. A temporary aggregate demand shock. So let's call this example number 1. So start yourself off with home base in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. So we're going to draw quite a few of these, so hopefully you'll get fast with them today. So long-run equilibrium, all 3 curves intersect. And suppose there is a negative demand shock that shifts aggregate demand to 82. So following our logic here, the current equilibrium state in the economy is always shown by the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve, which means there's going to be a downward adjustment of inflation to pi 2 and a recessionary gap. Let's call it Y2. All right, so in this chapter, I'm going to take kind of 2 philosophies, kind of 2 ideologies of economists. The classic economist, classical thought type economist is going to take a little more of a hands-off approach, whereas the Keynesian approach is going to be more hands-on with active government. So they kind of pose this in your chapter as activist versus non-activist approach. And so let me start with number 1. the non-activist approach. Non-activist approach. As its name insinuates, you don't do anything. How does the economy adjust on its own, right? So the natural adjustment, the invisible hand, if you will, that Adam Smith talked about, the invisible hand is going to lead to there being adjustments in resource prices. So the fundamentals here are the same, that resource prices were assumed constant along this short-run aggregate supply curve. So maybe the average nominal wages were $10 an hour, for instance. Is one kind of way that I like to think about it to hopefully keep some of these concepts a little bit easier. And so we have a fall in the economy with output prices, but not input prices. And that means there needs to be resource price adjustments so that the economy is always going to be headed in the long run through the invisible hand where the aggregate demand curve intersects the long run aggregate supply curve. So that's always kind of your eyeball of where you're marking where we're going to go. So we're planning to go here. How are we going to get there? The short run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right. I'll not draw the short run aggregate supply curve yet. And let's mark these points A, B, and C. So the non-activist approach, invisible hand, would be, let's write it down here, a increase in the short run aggregate supply curve, a shift to the right, moving towards point C. And it's just price adjustments. Prices are adjusting accordingly. All right, questions on that? Somewhat review of what we did in the previous chapter, of just thinking about how they would work. The activist approach is going to be to stimulate aggregate demand to move us back to A. So instead of allowing the economy to deflate, either way, notice we're getting back to potential level of real GDP in the long run. But let's just try to undo that negative shock. So activist approach is to be kind of a Keynesian. Is usually who we attribute that to. And we're going to increase aggregate demand and move to point A, move back to point A. Since we're talking about monetary policy in this chapter, what type of monetary policy is the Fed going to do? What are some options at its disposal? Just go back to their playbook. What's the Janet Yellen playbook?
Open market.
Open market operations. Sale or purchase?
Sale.
Sale. I've got a bond. I'm going to sell it. I'm Janet Yellen. I'm going to sell it. Can't suck those words back yet. And the money comes out of the economy. So sale's not the right way, right? I know it's tough. That's why I like to have that visual for you guys. So it's going to be an open market purchase of bonds. Janet goes in, grabs some stack of cash, goes to the market, and buys the bond. So an open market purchase of bond leads to an increase in the money supply, which then does what to interest rates? Lowers interest rates, right? So that's our transmission mechanism, is that the interest rates are going to fall and aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. So that's our mechanism. So increase in aggregate demand, we have an increase in the money supply leading to a decrease in interest rates and an increase in investment, which is a shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve. All right, so questions conceptually on what's going on there. We either got a movement this way down to C or A. Eventually, we got to get back there. All right, permanent supply shock. So Japan has been an example, and possibly the United States, but of some changes that were more permanent. So, example number 2, a permanent supply shock. So, we're using the word permanent, that it's more long run in nature. The example we talked about was maybe excessive regulation. That's a little undue. It's one example that the book works through. So go ahead and draw short or home base. So, with a permanent shift, both the long run and aggregate, so the long run and short run aggregate supply curve move together in kind of thinking about how far to the left they move at a given inflation rate. So you can kind of draw this graph by holding constant, I guess I didn't draw it in here, pi 1, then our new short run aggregate supply curve looks like this. And this is the new long run aggregate supply curve. I'll let you catch up. I know there's a lot of lines crisscrossing, so we're kind of taking the blue lines, are shifting both the short run and the long over by this amount, causing a potential for the economy to be located to the left of where we were before. We end up getting a bunch of potential equilibrium points here. So we started off at point A, got a point B. So the new equilibrium for the economy is always the new short run aggregate supply curve and the existing aggregate demand curve, since it wasn't an aggregate demand shift here. Is point B sustainable? No. Where are we headed? More inflation, less output, less inflation, more output, less inflation. Where are we heading from B? Straight up. See some people pointing in this direction. So where the economy is going with the non-activist approach, invisible hand, the prices are going to adjust, and that would be heading here to point C. So let's do our non-activist activist. So number 1, non-activist. I was going to go to activist first. Non-activist. Going to move from point B. There'll be a decrease in the short run aggregate supply curve to point C, where we're going to have higher inflation and lower GDP. Okay, so with the activist approach, activists with inflation targeting, I'm going to throw another variable in for you. So activist with inflation targeting. So let's assume that our initial equilibrium, we were at our target rate. So at point A, we were at our target rate. We get this supply shock. Economy moves to B. What are we going to do? Sell bonds or buy bonds? Sell bonds, right? So we're going to suck money out of the economy. So think about it this way, inflation's going up. Unfortunately, we're in a recession, so this is even harder to do because that's a contractionary monetary policy, right? That's a contractionary monetary policy. But if we think of this being a permanent supply shock, we're going to get there one way or the other. And so as inflation starts to go up, we kind of make it worse by pursuing an activist policy and increase interest rates, driving down the aggregate demand curve, moving to this point D, because we're on the inflation target. So we kind of go up and then we go down. As long as I'm thinking about it now, the textbook in your digital on the My Econ Lab has those animations, and they walk through all of these figures with their animations too. So if you want to review it that way later, you're welcome to. That's another spot you can go. Okay, so with inflation targeting, from new short-run equilibrium of point B, Fed decreases the money supply. Fed decreases the money supply, which leads to a decrease in aggregate demand to maintain the target. All right, questions on that one? All right, temporary aggregate supply shock. Example number 3. A temporary aggregate supply shock. So draw home base. And go ahead and put your inflation target in there too. So we'll say that currently the economy is in equilibrium and inflation is equal to the target level. So now we're going to have, and this is a negative shock. I guess I don't know if I said that. Negative shock. So no long run shift, just the short run. So the short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. There's a oil price increase, which was, by the way, in the news the last couple days that OPEC met, and the Saudis and their buddies have decided to restrict the world supply of oil I heard some economists predict that we might see our gas prices get up to 50 cents more a gallon at some point over the next upcoming year. These agreements have often broke down. They said that for the first time in a long time, the members of OPEC agreed to some sort of policing system internally for them to monitor the amount of barrels of oil that they're doing, which they haven't been doing for a while as an effort to make it credible, perhaps. And the other thing that will kind of be interesting to see is the response of the United States and maybe Russia. As they restrict oil prices go up, it all of a sudden becomes more profitable for us to take more oil here, and that's part of what they've been fighting. So, what's that? They did, yeah. There was a huge. They think it's larger than North Dakota down in Texas. They hit a big reserve. So yeah, all kinds of things happening in the oil world. All right, so if we have an oil price hike like that which could be coming, our prediction would be we've got higher inflation to pi 2. The economy moves from point A to point B. All right, so activist approach, non-activist approach. So what are our non-activists going to do? What are the non-activists? Oops, I just erased my target there. Oops, I did it again. That's the third time in a row. Non-activists. What are they going to promote doing? What is the nothing approach? Let it regulate itself. So the self-correcting mechanism is going to work. How is that going to play out graphically? What happens? And this one, right? The number one, I didn't put 1s and 2s here, but go back to where we were. Is that what you're thinking?
The one above it.
Above. Oh, up here? I hear some other people going, yeah? Yeah. Should I say yeah? That's the good question. All right, so what with this one, it's a little bit different with an external shock that drove us up. So this is, we're going to do a little bit more on this later, called cost push inflation. So cost push oil prices went up, and so that started to drive other prices up. If it was an oil price shock, there's lots of other resources in the economy, and so the mechanism back is for it to come back to A. And so it's just going to kind of come up and come back again. And in the long run, we're all dead, so Keynes isn't so hot on that typically. So, but that is our activist or non-activist response here. So that was a little bit trickier because it went up for a different reason. So non-activists, let's see. So there was a decrease in short-run aggregate supply due to, let me just put oil for our example. And this is a kind of a cost push inflation. So if it was, and by the way, the other thing that's kind of the catch here is that it's a temporary shock, right? So it kind of temporary went up. It's not necessarily going to stay forever either is the other part of that. So for the non-activists, in the long run, output and input prices will adjust to bring economy back to A with a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. Increase, sorry. Decrease is what we start on. A shift to the right. Okay, so that's with the non-activist. With the activist approach, we have inflation above its target. And so we're going to try to deflate things faster. So activist, since pi 2 is greater than our target, need to deflate the economy. Again, this is following the inflation target concept of what you'd be forced to do. So to do that, it's going to have the same effect we did before. Aggregate demand's going to shift to the right, to 82. So decrease in aggregate demand, which leads to a decrease in inflation back to the target, and a further decrease in output, which isn't too favorable. All right, so that is the dilemma that inflation targeting would find themselves in, is that now we'd be making it worse. Now, the hope would be that we've deflated the economy and that would start to move this back, and then the low interest rates would start to, or the aggregate demand would be stimulated to bring us back to A eventually with the activists. So we're kind of playing this game. It's kind of tough with this to think about the moving parts as they go, but ultimately we get back to A in a different way. So the decrease in inflation expectations leads to an increase in short-run aggregate supply. And expansionary monetary policy. An increase in aggregate demand. So these two things are kind of going on together, getting us back to point A. So ultimately, we've got this kind of circle jerk going back, where this one and this one are coming back. Hopefully, if they do it right, if Janet is really good, well, this is coming down, this is going up, and the actual path, the path of the movement is to kind of come this way. Economic, always using inflation targeting as their goal, that we'd start to see this expansion coming this way as both of these things kind of move together. Good in theory, not sure how well it works out in the big picture. Okay, questions on that one?
To decrease aggregate aggregate demand, you said it was open market purchase or sale?
So always remember me being Janet. If it's an open market purchase, me being Janet, I'm coming to the market. Open market purchase increases the money supply. Right? Open market sale would be Kurt's got money, I've got the bond, Janet goes to the market, sells the bond, takes the money, decreases the money supply.
Purchasing increases the money supply.
Yeah.
Decreases KD or increases?
When you're doing open market purchase, you're lowering the interest rates, stimulating the economy. So that would be an increase in aggregate demand. Okay. All right, one more. One more.
So they do all that just because they think prices are sticky?
Yeah, they do all that thinking that if we let the economy do it on its own, it's going to take too long. Yeah, and that they can orchestrate it better. The thought is they can do this little movement faster than the economy working on its own. So this last example, what are we on? Example number 4? Output stabilization. So let's just say that we're not doing the target. We're not doing inflation targeting. So output stabilization instead of inflation targeting. What does that look like? So go back and do a home base. So if we do with temporary aggregate supply shock. So we're doing the same example. Let's have a aggregate supply shock. So the OPEC does their thing, and boom, we're at SRAS2, moving the economy up to point B. This is all just the same as what we just did with the other one. The only difference is I'm going to say that the Fed is pursuing output stabilization. What's happening to unemployment when there's this oil price shock? Unemployment's going up, right? And so if we're thinking output stabilization and not worried about the inflation, what's the appropriate monetary policy response? Invisible hand, of course, is this coming back down. In the long run, we're all dead. Increase aggregate demand, right? So use monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy, and move aggregate demand up. But now it's at the expense of a higher inflation. But if inflation is pretty low in the first place, that might not be too big a deal. All right, so I know I throw a lot at you with these statements, but the purpose was to draw a conclusion about these trade-offs. And which should the Federal Reserve follow? Depends on the shock. So number one, if most shocks are aggregate demand shocks, if most shocks are aggregate demand shocks or permanent aggregate supply shocks, Then, inflation stabilization. That's our pi t using targeting. Works well. But this one kind of sucked because it drove us further into recession. So it doesn't work well with the aggregate supplies. So if temporary aggregate supply shocks are the norm, Fed must choose between kind of two evils, inflation or output stabilization. We have the big trade-off. With output stabilization, that sucks because we get higher inflation. We don't get back to where we were. And with this one, our move gives us lower output, betters inflation. So betters inflation, but worsens output. Right? Okay, so questions there? We're going to do a little more in-depth look at the video we did last time. There is an economist, Lawrence White, that's featured in the video, and we're going to take pieces of the video that we saw, and he's going to see them a little bit further, his interpretation of Austrian versus the Keynesian.
I once said that his theory was designed to explain the typical 19th century business cycle. Business cycles have been going on for a long time, throughout the 19th century. And there were a couple of main stylized facts that business cycle theorists in the 19th century were the forerunners of Wicksell and Mises and Hayek were trying to explain. One was the aggregate swing in the economy. Why does output as a whole go up and down? But secondly, why are the swings so much more pronounced in heavy industry, producer goods industries, in industries that the Austrians would identify as being more capital intensive or further consumption? So raw material industries, industries that produce very durable goods, goods that take a long time to yield their final services to consumers. So that was this disproportionality of the business cycle in investment goods, in producers' goods industries, was a fact that business cycle theorists tried to explain. The Austrian explanation was that, well, these are time-sensitive, interest-sensitive industries, so it's due to swings in the interest rate. In the Austrian capital theory, as Hayek has elaborated, and his big contribution is to integrate the capital theory more prominently into business cycle theory than Mises or Wicksell had. In this theory, we need to think about the time profile of outputs in the economy to reduce it to just two periods, the mix between production for the present and production for the future. The capital structure needs to be. The view was basically that business cycles consisted of a boom followed by a bust or a collapse of the boom. And what he was really aiming to explain was why the boom couldn't go on forever, why there was an upper turning point, what was inherently rotten at the core of the boom, why it had to fall apart. How investors threaten the economy. Basically, it's a credit bubble story. Not using bubble in the technical sense of a self-feeding frenzy, but an unsustainable path based on expansion and supply of credit beyond the supply of genuine savings. A healthy economy is one in which savings is coordinated with investment. Resources are allocated between present consumption and future consumption in accordance with the preferences of savers. So we need to get the right proportions between those two things. When people save, they save for something. They save for the sake of financing future consumption. When I say consumption, it could be sending kids to college, or it could be for retirement. The trade-off between present and future is captured by the interest rate. The interest rate is so many % per year, right? So it's a time-related variable. The market coordinates time and interest. The way that Excel thought about it, people who are saving are supplying loanable funds to the market. People who want to invest are demanding loanable funds. So the interest rate is the price that clears the market for loanable funds. You could put it another way and say it's the rate of exchange between the present and the future. But Margaret called it the premium on present consumption in exchange for future consumption. And so if I'm willing to give up a unit of present goods, I can have 1 plus the interest rate units of future goods. If the central bank injects more credit into the economy, it kind of pads the supply of savings. It makes it look as though there are more savings that are really available to complete investment projects that are initiated. Then entrepreneurs embark on projects that take too long to complete, too roundabout, in Bill Moderat's phrase. There are different ways to produce consumer goods. You can produce them in shorter, less roundabout ways that come to fruition more quickly. Or there are always, at any point in time, other ways to produce things that take longer to come to fruition, but that are more productive, but aren't currently being used because they take so long. And entrepreneurs look at the time value of money and say that takes too long. And so that's what when it becomes clear that consumers are not really willing to wait for the fruition of the projects that are initiated. When interest rates don't stay low, when they rise because inflation starts to rise or because the central bank decides that the boom is getting out of hand and raises interest rates, then they're caught out. Then there's a crisis. So one way to understand this in very concrete terms, no pun intended, is to think about building a house, or think about someone who is building a whole row of houses. He thinks he's got a pile of bricks big enough to build 10 houses. When he gets halfway through, he discovers, oh, wait a minute, I only have enough bricks to build 8 houses. Right? But he's already laid the foundations to build houses 9 and 10. So in order to salvage what he can, he's going to have to knock down houses 9 and 10. Some bricks are going to be lost. Right? There's waste when investment commitments are made that can't be carried through because everything can't be disassembled without losses. So he's going to discover that his investments were overly ambitious. He's going to have to abandon some of them, and there's going to be losses in the meantime. And until goods get reallocated, you're going to have a recession. But there's going to be a permanent loss to the economy's growth potential because of the mistaken investments that were made. Not everything's perfectly reversible. So when asset prices are artificially high, then it looks like the thing to do is to produce more assets. If housing prices are very high, the thing to do is to produce more housing. When it turns out that that price is not clearing the market, that there are lots of unsold houses at that price, the price needs to fall. And then you will have houses that were built at costs that can no longer be covered by the price they turn out to realize at distress at a foreclosure auction.
Okay, why don't you pull out your sheets? Does anybody who didn't get one of these sheets? I want to pass them on. So this is kind of a summary from, I don't know if we put this together, but the Austrian School of Economics is kind of, we call it the Austrian School, but it's really just meant to be an area that school of thought more than an actual physical place in Austria. In fact, it's not in Austria at all. But we call it the Austrian School of this way of thinking. So on this page, the front page, where it says Keynesian versus Austrian, we can look at how these two schools of thought diverge from each other. So at the first part, I guess I could have thrown this up on the gizmo. We've got our cigarettes, right? The focus with the Keynesians is typically on spending. We've got to get spending up. We're not spending enough. And so the Austrians think that's kind of a joke. One way that you can kind of see that is that if you're not spending over here on consumer goods and you're saving your money, then it should be rolling in through business investments, right? But the problem is the timing of that. So the consumption running to Walmart and making some purchases happens very quickly. And so it's an easy, kind of cheap way to get some action going by focusing in on spending. But all of that comes to roost eventually. And so in many ways, the Keynesians are more forward-thinking and thinking about the long term and not just any given year or any given quarter. And so that's part of what was focused on, that I wrote a few comments on the board about the malinvestment. This was just kind of something that dawned on me since we got the Keynes with sticky prices. I haven't ever heard that. That's again, a Russ Mattel special that I might work on a little bit. But we can kind of think of capital being sticky, that if you make a purchase, it's a big commitment and it's some risk. And so if you buy a tractor, if you spend your hard-earned money on a tractor, that tractor might be here for the next 30, 40 years. Same thing with the building. Same thing with other pieces of equipment. The lifetime is usually greater than a year, right? And so that's what I was thinking about, kind of capital being sticky, that a lot of people don't think about, that how effective that can be for long-term growth. Okay, so then let's move down to the business cycle. So here's the two main differences. Animal spirits, we talked about layoffs and sticky wages. Government must step in with expansionary monetary policy. Government boosts the aggregate demand by increasing government section of GDP, maybe public works and other things. Spending on circulates, gets people back spending, and then the cycle continues. So the focus is then on the demand side and the spending side. Whereas the Keynesians come in with the Fed kind of driving things originally by maybe keeping interest rates too low. That spurs investment and purchases of homes. That creates demand that's not really there. Because it was cheaper, there seemed to be kind of a fake demand curve for housing, causing housing prices to soar and creating that bubble. Eventually, that comes to roost, and we have our bust with the foreclosures and other things, and then the interest rate, we kind of go back to that cycle. So the mentality is that our business cycle is caused more by intervention of government and distorting the choices that the private sector would have otherwise made. So I use the word keeping home prices low through government programs for home buyers, right? We're, in the big picture, channeling more investment into housing, right? What's to say that the house is the best place? Maybe renters aren't evil. Maybe it's okay if people rent places for a while to live. That the best thing isn't a home, as maybe some of the traditional logic goes. All right, so questions or comments on that? Start to see kind of some of the nuances. I mean, we're getting a little bit deeper into macroeconomic theory and how this world actually works. So this is definitely a stark contrast from some of the mechanics that we do in aggregate demand, aggregate supply. All right, we will see you on Monday, our last and final day. Yay!